Hello guys, and welcome to the second sub-chapter where we'll be talking about designing anatomy. It will focus more on designing a face because personally I think the face is the most important part of the character in most cases. Once you've got the face down, I'll give you a guideline to create the body, and I'll explain roughly how later on. I want to start off by introducing something that you're probably familiar with already, called the same face syndrome. The same face syndrome is essentially what happens when your art style makes all the characters have the same facial traits or very similar ones. The most distinguishable things tend to be the color scheme, their clothes, their hairstyle, etc. It actually affects a lot of artists, and it's not inherently a bad thing. Some art styles make it work extremely well. I do tend to see that the more realistic your art style is, the more troublesome the same face syndrome becomes, since our brains are wired to look for more subtle differences in anatomy the more realistic the style is, and it might get a little confusing. I'll talk a little about same face syndrome and how to avoid it if you don't think it works with your style or have it but want to try and branch out. First of all, how can you tell if you've got same face syndrome? That's a question that I've asked myself a lot, since I personally don't like same face syndrome in my art style and very consciously attempt to get away from it. I've got a little thing here, a little flowchart of sorts. If you draw a couple of your characters with lines only on the same angle and with the same expressions, you can ask yourself, do they look the same or too similar? If not, try to get the hair out of the equation and compare it again. Do they look the same? If so, you may have some same face syndrome going on there. Most of the time, same face syndrome isn't that easy to spot, and I think it's present in a lot of art styles to an extent, or at least in art styles that are similar to mine. It might genuinely just be a reflection of your own preferences, biases, and habits, and even be present between two characters but not all across your character portfolio. Whether you need to actively fight it or not depends on whether it actively bothers you or not. Personally, I find that my same face syndrome has to do with the placement of eyes, nose, mouth, and elements of the face in general, and the proportions I tend to fall into. As an interesting side note, I've also noticed that you could argue that often artists resemble their art styles in terms of facial structure, and that in itself can be reflected in the art as an instance of same face syndrome. To close this little note off, I've listed some pros and cons of same face syndrome that I was able to single out. In terms of pros, it can, for instance, push you to be more creative designing hair, body, and clothing. Because the face is fundamentally the same, you're going to have to invest in other distinguishable features. It can also give your art style a more marked signature. If your faces follow a very homogeneous trend, they'll tend to be easily recognizable. It can make you faster since you don't have to spend too long thinking about the face designs, etc., etc. In terms of cons, if your comic is black and white, like a manga style thing, it can become confusing for the reader to tell characters apart if they're not sporting their usual hairstyle, if they've got similar hairstyles, etc. Along the same line, it can make you too reliant on color to avoid narrative confusion. And the worst offender, in my opinion, is that it can make your characters feel less unique amongst each other. Of course, this is usually not a big problem, as simply giving them different emotions or baseline facial expressions can easily tell them apart. But I do like to see variety stretch farther than that when facial traits are involved. Lastly, it can make the design inflexible. Again, if you have same face syndrome that relies on a specific hairstyle, for instance, it might become a problem when you want the character to change the hair for any narrative reason. With this being said, what are some ways you can avoid it? This is what I'll be focusing more on this chapter. Towards the end, I'll illustrate it by showing you a process video of my design process. So back to my basic elements of the face, in terms of their actual shape now. We've got the eyebrow or the brow, the eye shape, the nose, lips, face shape, etc. These give you endless combinations of shapes that can help you tell faces apart without massive differences, but with enough differences to make your characters distinguishable. I'm a fan of this type of design where the differences are there but they're subtle, and again, it's something that might not be as effective for more cartoony styles. What I did here was start from a basic face, make each section pointed out above vary, and translate that to the row below, so towards the end we get a plethora of different faces with some common elements. I started with the eyebrows, as you can see here, and made them vary along this line. Then I picked the first one and changed its eye shape along this line. Eye shapes are particularly defining for me, and just by changing this one detail you can get characters with fundamentally different or similar energies. The third one focuses on the lips. Unlike the eyes, to me lips add a lot of diversity to designs but aren't as intertwined with personality or energy. For face shape, the jawline can be sharp, round, square, cheekbones higher or lower, or more or less prominent, etc. And lastly, in a different perspective so it's easier to see, the nose is another thing you can play around with as much as you want. I have the habit of keeping the noses roughly at the same length, since it's more visually appealing to me in my style, but besides shape, you can also freely play around with length, projection, etc. In general, when it comes to faces, the only basic constraints you have are the relative positions of these things listed before. Within those boundaries, you can, and I encourage you to, try out different shapes and combinations, or even look at real-life references and how those differences can translate to a drawing. Of course, it's nothing mandatory. As much as design variety can be a fun, enriching thing to try out, I'm the first one to admit that I've got my biases and facial features and forms that I prefer to both draw and see over others. Personally, I think that's alright as long as you don't feel like you're repeating features because you're afraid to get out of your comfort zone or feel like you lack the confidence or skills to do it. Next up, some examples on how a character's personality can help you decide what facial features to go for, even if subtly. I brought up some examples based on my own characters and will quickly run you through them. So the first row shows you a couple of characters with very stern types of personality, which is part of the reason why, despite having very distinct features, they share some things like the straight nose bridges, somewhat square jawlines, sharp eye shapes, and thick eyebrows. On the second row, the characters don't share jaw, nose, or eyebrow shape, but they've got similar eye shape and angles, meant to hint at a more aloof, low-energy kind of demeanor. The last one shows more of a contrast. These are characters that are meant to take up a lot of screen time side by side, and whose personalities are distinct in a lot of ways, so that influenced me to give them different angles, levels of sharpness, and overall different features wherever I could. Of course, you can't directly map someone's personality to their facial features, but for the sake of character design, it can be a good tool to have at hand. In terms of general body design, I created a little scheme here that divides types of body into three main shapes. This isn't to say the actual body shape is influenced by these, but more to say that when designing bodies with these shapes in mind, you'll get different effects even if for the same level of musculature or fitness. I mentioned earlier that I'd put emphasis on facial feature design because it would act as a guide for the body, and that's also the case through these shapes. If you've got sharper, slimmer facial features in general, it might indicate that the rest of your body follows the same trend, so you'd want to design it with emphasis on triangle-like forms for muscles and sections. If you've got softer, more rounded facial features, same thing, and in that case you might want to draw the body with smoother lines in general, even if it's extremely muscular or extremely thin. The square shape is more linked to the bone structure, where you can have different body types, but in general you'll get wider jaws, joints, etc., and an overall squarer shape. These are, of course, only guidelines and examples of the way you can use these shapes chosen for the face when thinking about the body, on top of the factors considered in the previous video regarding the character's own lifestyle and context. Next up, I'll bring up a couple of time lapses of me applying these ideas to a new character design. This will be split into two parts, the face design and the body design, and I'll be talking about the process in the meantime. The videos are also sped up by 2 times, as there's a lot of back and forth in this initial stage. Right, so let's start by drawing the face. As I've mentioned before, this character in particular is going to be designed via contrast and similarities to their counterpart, and based on personality traits I've already established for them. I've got the other character's design up here, created a priori, and pretty much the final version already. As you can see, right off the bat, the base for the face is rounder, with softer lines and less sharp angles. I'm making a conscious effort to emphasize that, as their personalities are fundamentally different, and I wanted to reflect on their facial expression and design. Ao, the character on the left, tends to be cold and detached with little emotional output, whereas the new character, nicknamed V, is meant to be more expressive, outgoing, and emotional. That's what I'm trying to convey here, even drawing them with a little smile to start with. Another area where I want the contrast to be noticeable is the nose. Instead of being perked up like Owl's nose, I'll start by drawing it with a straighter line and take it from there, with a lot of back and forth until I'm satisfied with the result. Again, nothing is mathematical when designing a character, especially not the first time you draw them, so the things I mentioned in this video are just a base to start off from. The eyes are angled up as well, to contrast with Owl's eyes that have a very obvious down-facing shape. Same thing with the eyebrows to an extent. As you can see, I like to work on short, soft lines and leave them on for the process using the alpha eraser I mentioned in the first chapter to add or delete things as I go. It makes it obvious to see when I'm trying to work out the planes and structures underneath. Another thing worth pointing out is that for this phase I don't start with a full sketch, since I don't entirely know what I'll be drawing, but I use a brush that's around twice my normal line art brush size to keep it loose and sketchy. It helps me focus on the bigger picture and not get carried away with details. As you can see, a lot of the process is similar to sculpting things in and out to me. I started off with a rough idea of the shapes I wanted, and now I'm testing the ground to see if they're getting closer to the actual character in my head. The contrast idea is in the back of my mind, but V and Owl also have a lot of background in common, so I'll allow myself to not hold that too strictly and play around with some sharper features here and there. I added some shading with a big marker brush that I downloaded recently just because I like the effect. Again, I think a lot of character design should be fun. You shouldn't feel like it's a chore unless you're doing it for a client, and even so, it's good to try and make the process as enjoyable as possible to you. This is the reason why I'm not the biggest fan of creating character sheets unless you absolutely have to, as is the case with animation projects and the like. Take this opportunity to play around with brushes, techniques, shapes, etc., and try to get something from it. I'm drawing them bald to add the hair afterwards and have a good sense of its volume. I'll cut to the body before drawing the hair, as I'll want to focus on that part of the video later. So now I already have the hair done, and I've also got Owl's body sketched on the side. It's a mix between triangular and square shape, with a lot of straight lines, semi-developed musculature, and overall just an elongated sort of shape. This goes along with Owl's facial features, as I explained earlier. For contrast's sake, I'm making V significantly shorter, with a curvier body and in a more expressive pose. It's again a somewhat subtle difference, as I still want them to look like they've got a common background and similar occupations, so I keep throwing back to that common thread. I started this off with some basic lines I wouldn't necessarily call action lines, but for all intended purposes, they're the ones I guide myself by. I tweak the pose according to my perception of the center of gravity of the body in pose, and go back and forth flipping the canvas to ensure the pose is balanced from all angles. I'm aiming for a somewhat androgynous silhouette, a bit more on the feminine side, but with some developed musculature. Both for fun and to orient myself better, I'm usually careful to have muscle and joint lines whenever I can. The arms are a bit tricky. As with any pose, they'll take some adjustment both in terms of position and in terms of length. I tend to emphasize the collarbones a lot, not only for anatomical purposes, but also because they're great reference points for the rest of the body. Collarbones will tell you where the body is centered, what the head tilt is, where the shoulders should be, etc. Again, some more fixing up the position, the anatomy, etc. And once again, I do recommend drawing muscle lines wherever you can, no matter the body type, as they're a great help in this kind of full body shot. And that's it for the body, face and hair, which I'll get to in the next video. Personally, I'm happy with their vibe and the contrast with Owl, so I'll go forward and call it the final design for now. Next video, we'll talk a bit more about hair and I'll show you what designing it for V was like. See you then!